pleased to open this hearing on children in crisis, the human and lasting... Greetings. I'm pleased to open this hearing on children in crisis, the human and lasting impact of this administration's child separation policy. For generations, one of the best-known symbols of our country is the Statue of Liberty. Lady Liberty has held a torch to light the way for families fleeing persecution from around the world. Inscribed on her base are these words: "From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." But over the past several weeks, our country has watched as this inscription has been replaced by a different principle by President Trump and his team. That different principle has been that should you flee persecution and wash up on the shores of the United States of America, then you will be greeted with handcuffs, you will be treated as a criminal, you'll be thrown in prison, and your children will be taken away from you. This is not the welcome presented by Lady Liberty, and this is not the dignified and fair treatment of those fleeing persecution. Before I continue with remarks, I'm going to turn to Senator Van Hollen to introduce his guest.
Thank you, Senator Merkley, and thank all of you for being here to testify about the inhumane policy of separating parents and their children. I want to thank Senator Merkley for convening this discussion. Great to be here with Senator Hassan. On Father's Day, I joined Senator Merkley at the border between the United States and Mexico, where we witnessed firsthand the implementation of that cruel policy of separating moms and dads from their kids. And we had an opportunity to talk to lots of moms who were totally overwhelmed and distraught by the possibility they would never see their kids again. And even though we've got an executive order, we also know this administration has stated that they're in absolutely no hurry at all to reunite these kids who are scattered in different places around the country with their moms and dad. And that's outrageous, and we need to make sure that we do everything we can to make that happen. I want to now introduce a witness here we have from the state of Maryland, from Baltimore, Danya Underwood, who has spent over 15 years working on child welfare issues. In her current role, she's the Director for Children and Family Services at the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which is the nation's second largest refugee resettlement agency. She's partnered with the federal government, with child welfare organizations, state and local governments to ensure that unaccompanied minors and separated families are protected and embraced by the communities. We know that we've got a heck of a fight ahead of us. Thank you all for being here. Ms. Underwood, thank you very much for your leadership. And I'm going to try and get back. I happen to have a Foreign Operations Subcommittee hearing with Secretary Pompeo starting right now, but I'm looking forward to getting back and certainly following the testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Van Hollen, and thank you for introducing your constituent from Maryland. The American people have woken up to this strategy promoted by President Trump's team. They have seen the 30 by 30 foot cages into which young men and young women have been herded, separated from their parents. They have heard or seen about the American border guards blocking the bridge of access at ports of entry to prevent those seeking asylum from actually arriving in the United States of America. The American people have listened to the recordings of young children crying and wailing for their parents. And as they have heard about these heart-wrenching stories, they have considered the plight of parents that they can certainly identify with who have no idea where their sons and daughters have been taken and if they will ever see them again. This issue is not about border security. In fact, back in 2013, every single Democrat in the Senate voted to provide the tools and resources necessary to strengthen our border security when we passed the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Enforcement Act of 2013. That act included $46 billion for border enforcement. And that act passed overwhelmingly with Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. It only didn't become law because the Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker of the House, decided that it didn't merit, border security wasn't important enough to put that bill on the floor of the House. So let's just be clear, that's not what this is about. What it is about is a decision by the Trump administration to inflict cruelty on children, to inflict trauma on children, to advance a strategy of deterrence and a strategy of legislative leverage. We've heard this firsthand from our Attorney General, who laid out the argument that if you treat children and their families in this manner when they are seeking asylum, we will send a message to the world not to come and seek asylum in the United States of America. We've heard firsthand from the President of the United States saying that this advances his efforts to create legislative leverage to build his wall. Let me be absolutely clear that injuring children to advance legislative leverage or send a message of deterrence, or for any reason, is not acceptable under any moral code or religious tradition. This is a morally bankrupt policy. And over the past 3 weeks, the American people have weighed in saying exactly that. It is a powerful public outcry, an outcry so strong that President Trump signed an executive order last week. Now, the president in doing so, unfortunately, has continued a strategy of injuring children to send a message. He has pivoted from a strategy of separating children from their parents, which is one way to harm them, to a strategy of handcuffs for all. Let's lock up the children with their parents. He's advocated for establishing family internment camps. We certainly know that that was a terrible moral mistake during World War II for Japanese American families, and it's a moral mistake now. What the president hasn't done is to take personal responsibility for having implemented this policy in the first place. He can end this policy with a stroke of a pen, just as he created it. But instead, we're hearing about plans for tent cities. We're hearing about plans for incarcerating 20,000 people at military bases. But last night, we heard from a California court. A judge noted that this is an unacceptable policy, that children under the age of 5 must be returned to their parents, reunited, within 14 days, and for older children, within 30 days. Our hope is that the president's team doesn't appeal this, but instead uses it as a moment to gain urgency and emphasis and energy behind a strategy of reuniting children with their parents. We are very pleased to have with us a number of experts today. We've heard the introduction of Ms. Danya Underwood, and welcome. It's great to have you. We also have, via video conference, Mimi Marziani, president of the Texas Civil Rights Project, who will lay out the stories of immigrants that the Texas Civil Rights Project is representing at the border, as well as describe what has changed on the ground since President Trump signed his executive order last week. Also welcome to Heidi Altman, the Director of Policy at the National Immigrant Justice Center, who is here to speak about her organization's work representing and helping immigrant parents who have been separated from their children, help them navigate the immigration system. She previously served as a legal director for the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition, where she oversaw the provision of legal services to men, women, and children in immigration custody. Dr. Nadine Burke Harris is the founder and CEO of the Center for Youth Wellness. She is a leader in the movement to transform how we respond to early childhood adversity and the resulting toxic stress that impacts the health and longevity of our children. She's here to speak from a medical standpoint about the policy of separating families and how it damages children. Her work has earned her the Arnold P. Gold Foundation's Humanism in Medicine Award, presented by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the Heinz Award for the Human Condition. And we have Reverend Dr. Carmelo Santos. Reverend Santos is a senior pastor at Hope Lutheran Church, a chemist turned pastor, a theologian, who is here to provide a moral perspective and will speak to the administration's misuse of religion and the Bible to justify a cruel and inhumane policy. Thank you all for being here today, and I believe that we are going to begin in the following order, starting with Mimi Marziani. Welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can see you, and folks in the room can see you as well. Thank you.
And we can hear you.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for letting me testify, and thank you in particular for letting me testify remotely. As I will describe, we are extraordinarily busy on the front lines in Texas, and so I really do appreciate you accommodating my schedule. I'd like to tell you a couple of things this morning. In brief, I will tell you about the work of the Texas Civil Rights Project and what we've been doing. Then I'd like to share just a couple of the stories we've heard from parents we are representing. And then finally, I wanted to highlight some of the developments of the last 48 hours that I hope this committee will pay particular attention to. So number one, the Texas Civil Rights Project provides Texas lawyers for Texas communities. We pride ourselves on providing excellent legal representation, particularly for the state's most vulnerable population. Accordingly, we got phone calls from the community in mid-May when people started frantically seeing that families crossing over the border were being systematically separated. And these parents were coming into criminal court and sobbing and asking about their children. And so beginning about 6 weeks ago, our team has been in McAllen Criminal Court every single day, and McAllen is located in the Rio Grande Valley. And we have been talking to these parents, interviewing them before their criminal arraignment, getting their information. We've been using that information to do a couple of things. We have an ongoing proceeding with something called the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. We are representing all of these parents in that proceeding, trying to stop family separations. In addition, we have been working to track these families, figure out where everybody is, get everybody connected with underlying immigration counsel, and then use communications advocacy and relying on people like yourselves to make sure that their stories are heard. To date, we represent 381 parents, and they have collectively 397 children. And so that is a significant number of the roughly 2,000 families who have been separated to date. And so because of our experience, I can speak to you personally about the stories we've heard. I know my time is short this morning, so I will keep it brief, but I would like to tell everybody that, both as a career civil rights attorney and as a mom, these are some of the most horrific things I have ever heard. One of the first stories we heard in May that prompted us to embark on this initiative was a mother who told us that after fleeing violence, she was told by Border Patrol agents that they were going to give her young daughter a bath, and her young daughter was never brought back to her. We've heard more recently from a dad from Guatemala who's raised his daughter himself since she was very, very young. Fleeing violence, they came into this country, and he was told basically with a very short period of time that he was going to be separated from his daughter. And so he told her she was going to summer camp to try to alleviate her fears. And she walked away excited. And now he is just racked with guilt. He has no idea where she is or how she's being treated. We've heard from lots of mothers who have endured unspeakable things, including and especially rape. We've also was told by one mother how gangs brutally murdered her husband. She then fled with herself and her 11-year-old son. Once she got to the border, she told agents that she feared for her life because her husband had been murdered. And she was told that she was going to be deported and that she'd never see her son ever again. The last story I will share is that we very recently learned that one of the fathers who we interviewed has been deported back to Guatemala, and his children are still here in the United States. I, again, can assure you that these, to me personally, these stories are the stuff of nightmares, and I have been warmed, I think, to see the American people in the last couple of weeks, to see leaders like yourself pay attention to this incredible issue. And even now, when the situation is changing rapidly, to continue to be vigilant and continue to demand questions. A couple of things I will just highlight that I would welcome questions on that we've seen in the last 48 hours or so. One, despite the executive order, and maybe because of it, we have seen several parents disappear from the immigration system. When somebody is no longer able to be located in the immigration system, that usually means that they have been released or deported. These individuals were all at the Port Isabel facility in South Texas, and we believe and fear that they were indeed deported. In addition, as Senator Merkley noted, late last night there was an injunction from a federal court. The judge talked in great detail about the unspeakable cruelty of the family separation policy and has ordered, among other things, that families be separated very quickly. We are very eager to see how that is going to be implemented. Our experience on the ground leads us to have very grave concerns about the mechanism that the federal government currently has for bringing people back together. And I would welcome questions about what that injunction does and what it doesn't do. And finally, the last thing that I would welcome to discuss further is what happens after we are able to reunite families. And I would really implore all of you that family detention, jailing babies and toddlers is not the answer here, that we actually have systems in place to monitor folks while their immigration proceedings are ongoing. And those have been successful and not just legal and moral, but also cheaper too. So I'd welcome questions on that as well. But with that, thank you again, and I look forward to hearing from the fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Ms. Marziani, and we appreciate you appearing before us in this electronic format and all the work your organization is doing. And we're now turning to the Director of Policy, National Immigrant Justice Center, Heidi Altman.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Merkley, for your leadership in bringing us all together today, and to all of you for being here. I'm going to speak today a bit about the story of one woman whose tale feels like it should be an outlier, but unfortunately is actually quite illustrative of what many hundreds and thousands of families are facing. One of the mothers our organization is representing, as well as children, we represent on both sides in ICE and DHHS custody. Gabriella, as I'm going to call her today, can't be here herself because she is behind the very thick walls and concertina wires of a big private prison-operated immigration detention center in San Diego, the Otay Mesa Detention Center. Gabriella has been telling me that it's difficult for her to sleep at night because she can't stop crying. The officers at the facility offered her sleeping pills, but she has stopped taking them because they make what she calls the pain in her heart worse. What she's tormented by is the memory of the moment when she saw her 12-year-old son for the last time. She's desperate to talk to him. And what I could feel very palpably when I last spoke with her is that with every day that goes by, she believes, and I think with reason, based on her experience, that our government has not taken her child from her temporarily, but permanently. She fears that he'll be taken away from her forever. This terror weighs very physically on her. You can see when you look at her that she is sunken in, and she has already survived so much. So Gabriella fled years of brutal violence at the hands of her domestic partner in El Salvador. She had to bury her firstborn child, who died at the age of 3. She fought to escape the violence in her home, only to be confronted by more violence. When she refused to be the forced girlfriend of a gang leader in her neighborhood, men broke into her home, sexually assaulted her, left her son traumatized. She attempted suicide shortly after that, but she survived, and she turned to protecting her family immediately. She rallied herself, she rallied her son, and she fled. She did the only thing she knew to protect her child and brought him here to the United States. Where their journey ended was when they were stopped by a Border Patrol officer, and they were taken for processing at a CBP facility. She was taken to one room, her son taken to another. She realized that she was looking at one-way glass, so she could see her son, but he couldn't see her. She was told that she was going to be taken to a federal facility because she was being charged with illegal entry. She could see her son was crying. She couldn't say goodbye to him. She wasn't permitted even to explain to him why they were being separated. She began pleading to the officer to please allow them to stay together, and she remembers that she said, "He's just a child." And this Border Patrol officer mocked her in response and said, looking at this 12-year-old boy, "No, he's grown." So now it's been 2 months since Gabriella last saw her child. When I saw her on Friday, still in ICE custody, she had been permitted to speak with him one time. She has a phone number where she uses her own funds to try to reach him in the custody of Office of Refugee Resettlement. When she calls, the number rings and rings. She tells me that she doesn't eat sometimes because she fears that if she leaves the area of the jail where the phones are, she'll miss somehow a phone call from him. This basic inability to connect via phone or video conference with her child is very common across the parents and the children we see in ICE and ORR custody, as is the fact that Gabriella went weeks before she even knew where her child was. Basic human decency tells us, and we've heard already from so many, that Gabriella and Christopher should not have been torn apart when they arrived at our border seeking safety. But I want to emphasize, and I'm grateful that Mimi did as well, that neither would it have been just for them to have been jailed together in a tent camp, in a detention center, in a jail. There is a better way. Put quite simply, Secretary Azar testified yesterday to what he claims to be the impossibility of reuniting families. There's no impossibility. DHS simply needs to release the parents, and they have wide discretion to do so, in many cases on bond, in other cases on parole, in other cases into the alternative detention programs that they are extremely well funded to the tune of $180 million in the last appropriation cycle to operate. These programs are vastly cheaper than detention. They have sky-high rates of compliance. Most importantly, when operated under a truly community-based model, which we believe requires that they be operated by a nonprofit entity, they offer a compassionate and dignified and lawful welcome to these families and other individuals arriving in need. One example, which many of you are familiar with, is the Family Case Management Program, of course, which was put up at the end of the last administration, provided case management-based services in the community to families, achieved 99% compliance rates for individuals at their ICE check-ins, 100% compliance rates with immigration court hearings, costs approximately $30 per family as compared to $319 for a family detention bed. This administration terminated that program in April of 2017. I, like Mimi, am very happy and welcome questions about what we are currently seeing since the issuance of the executive order, which is largely no change in the reunification process for these families or their ability to communicate. I also am happy to answer questions about the grave alarm we're feeling that we continue to see families separated at ports of entry, which directly contradicts what Secretary Azar, Secretary Nielsen, and others have testified before you and your colleagues. And lastly, I want to thank you for honoring the story of Gabriella and so many others like her by being here today, by continuing to remain vigilant against this administration's truly human rights abuses committed against them and the wide-ranging assaults on asylum seekers and other immigrants at the border and in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that, and we're going to now turn to Ms. Danya Underwood, Director of Children and Family Services for the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Senator Merkley and distinguished members of this body. I am honored to be here today to present testimony on the impacts of the zero tolerance policy that resulted in the mass separation of families apprehended at the U.S. and Mexico border. Again, my name is Danya Underwood, and I have been working in child welfare with vulnerable populations for over 15 years, and I'm currently the Director for Children and Family Services at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service has worked with the Office of Refugee Resettlement since 2003, and we are the only organization in the country that walks alongside unaccompanied refugee and migrant children and their families throughout their entire journey in the United States through short-term foster care, family reunification, and post-release services. Since 2017, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service has been monitoring instances of family separation at our southern border. We have placed 148 children since that time, and almost 50 who were under the age of 5. At this time, I would like to tell you about 2 of these young children. The first story is about a girl that I'll call Sophia. In March 2018, Sophia, now 9 months, was taken from her father, Jose, as they crossed the Mexico-U.S. border. While Jose was detained at the Rio Grande Detention Center in Laredo, Texas, his infant daughter was transferred to an LIRS short-term foster care program. After multiple failed attempts to connect Jose in the detention facility, Sophia's foster care case manager was finally able to reach Jose. During this call, Sophia's father shared that he was extremely worried because he did not know where Sophia had been taken. Sophia was too young to share her story and information about herself, so her case manager went to work trying to locate her father. Sophia's mother in Honduras share information about herself, so the case manager went to work to locate Sophia's mother actually in Honduras and additional family members in the U.S. Once reaching Sophia's mother, Maria described how Sophia and her father crossed the border to find safety after Jose faced political persecution for his membership and support for a certain political party in Honduras. 2 months prior to Sophia's journey to the U.S. with her father, says Maria, her mother, the family's car was set aflame. Fearing further retaliation and harm to Sophia, her family arranged for her journey to the United States. Maria made the agonizing decision not to take the perilous journey with her then 6-month-old daughter, Sophia, because she needed to remain in Honduras to care for her ailing mother. When initially arriving to the short-term foster care program, Sophia appeared irritated and tired, and came down with a runny nose and fever and a short cough. But once arriving to the foster home and being held in the safe, warm arms of her foster mother, she quickly and comfortably fell asleep. Within a few hours and days of arrival, Sophia received a routine medical screening and received the care she needed for an infection. She was described as happy and calm, and an infant that loved to play. Although Sophia's father is currently applying for asylum based on political persecution aimed at himself and his family, he made the decision for Sophia to be reunified and live with his mother, who is described as a stable resident in the U.S. Sophia has now been released to her grandmother, but was not granted post-release services, despite being only 9 months old. Post-release services have been proven to be essential following family reunification to ensure a child's safety and well-being, increasing the ability of caregivers to protect and meet the child's needs. Although family reunification, when safe and appropriate, is in the child's best interest, it can also be a highly stressful time for caregivers who need support, culturally appropriate services, and community referrals. The second story I will quickly share with you is about Catalina. So in May 2018, Catalina, a 3-year-old girl from Honduras, crossed the border in Laredo, Texas with her father, her mother, and 9-month-old brother. Upon apprehension, Catalina was removed from her mother's arm while her mother and brother were separated and detained together, and her father separated and detained at the Rio Grande Detention Center. Shortly after being taken from her family, Catalina was placed in a Alera short-term foster care program. When Catalina arrived, she was noticeably impacted by her separation from her mom, dad, and baby brother. While trying to tell her story, Catalina was despondent, crying and easily upset. Although multiple contacts were made in an attempt to reach Catalina's father in the detention facility, facility staff did not connect the case manager to Catalina's father, nor did they relay messages to her father to facilitate communication. While in short-term foster care, Catalina has been engaged in play therapy. Although initially reluctant to participate and attend, often crying during her first session, Catalina has become a willing participant, playing as usual in sand trays and engaging the therapist, often demonstrating in comfort by searching for toys and, of course, instructing the therapist how and what they should be playing. Catalina becomes a happy and very talkative toddler while with her therapist. However, during one therapy session, Catalina shared a horrific event she witnessed, a police officer murdering her grandmother, and broke down crying from the memories. So earlier this month, Catalina's mother was released along with her infant son and made contact with the LRS short-term foster care program. Catalina has finally been able to speak with her mother through video chat. Catalina sobbed throughout the call and cried that she wanted to live with her mom. It was a heartbreaking call to observe, the case manager reported. But the mother and therapist case manager were able to comfort Catalina and soothe her wounded heart. After the call ended, Catalina began to continue to play in the sand tray, but eventually turned to the therapist and again asked for her mother and her father. The lost toddler began to sob, calling to be with her mother and father again and again. In order to help Catalina cope with being separated, the family and Catalina's foster parents have been learning relaxation techniques. Although Catalina visibly enjoys playing with her infant foster child and is crying less and less at bedtime since she arrived at the program, Catalina is unable to provide insight into her emotions, thoughts, and experiences and cannot comprehend why she has been taken from her family. Catalina frequently asked to go home to her mother and father. A family friend was identified as Catalina's potential sponsor, but has not actively participated in the reunification process. As a result, Catalina remains in a short-term foster care program. So I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to provide testimony today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Underwood. And now Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and I'm a pediatrician and the founder and CEO of the Center for Youth Wellness, a health organization created to advance the research and clinical care of toxic stress in children. You don't have to be a doctor to recognize that a child being forcibly separated from their parents' care faces long-term psychological and emotional harm. But we now know this type of trauma, left unaddressed, can more than double an individual's risk for asthma, autoimmune disease, chronic lung disease, and cancer, and can cut their life expectancy short by decades. Research from the CDC, Kaiser Permanente, and many others demonstrates that adverse childhood experiences, like being forcibly separated from a parent or caregiver, substantially increases the risk for negative physical and psychological outcomes, both in the short term and later in life. Here's why. When any one of us experiences something scary or threatening, our brains and bodies activate our stress response system that leads to the production of high levels of stress hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol, and is responsible for many of the feelings that we associate with being terrified. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, is activated, and the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functioning, including judgment and impulse control, is inhibited. Stress hormones stimulate our hearts to beat stronger and faster, raise our blood pressure and blood sugar, and activate our immune system, among many other effects. The stress response is a normal and, in fact, essential part of our biological processes and allow us to respond and adapt to challenging circumstances. However, children facing severe stress require the nurturing care of a trusted adult to shut off the stress response and restore normal functioning. Without this nurturing buffer, the biological stress response becomes overactive. Children are uniquely vulnerable to the effects of an overactive stress response because their brains and bodies are just developing. High levels of adversity without the buffering protection of a trusted caregiver leads to changes in brain structure and function, weakening of the immune system, impairment of hormonal levels, and these changes are what is now recognized by the American Academy of Pediatrics as the toxic stress response. Toxic stress can literally change the way a child's DNA is read and transcribed, leading to long-term health effects. A nurturing caregiver is critical for interrupting this biological process. Nurturant caregiving regulates levels of cortisol and adrenaline and other stress hormones and releases healthy hormones, including oxytocin, that protect a child's developing brain and cardiovascular system. As parents, when our children face something scary, such as a scary experience or injury, we instinctively hold them close. That loving hug releases the hormone oxytocin, which inhibits the stress response and helps to deactivate this biological process. Many of the children coming to our borders have already been traumatized by gang violence, domestic abuse, and extreme poverty in their home countries. These children desperately need the care and healing of a trusted adult. Accounts of workers at a Texas shelter for migrant children being instructed to feed their charges, clothe them, and change their diapers, but not hold or comfort crying children are especially troubling. With the thousands of children detained, we are witnessing a health crisis in the making. In my clinic in San Francisco, I see the effects of toxic stress every day. The physical and emotional risks to these children are real. In infants and young children, it can manifest as failure to thrive, sleep disturbance, and developmental delay, as well as increased risk for viral infection, bacterial infection such as pneumonia, and other illnesses. In school-age children and adolescents, we see increased inflammation, hypersensitivity such as allergies, eczema, and asthma, autoimmune disease, obesity, pubertal changes, as well as disorders of mood, behavior, and learning. At the Center for Youth Wellness, we've been pioneering multidisciplinary treatments for toxic stress. And while there's still much work to be done, the evidence demonstrates promising interventions to help regulate an overactive stress response and improve outcomes for kids. Step 1 is minimizing the dose of adversity to which children are exposed. And step 2 is enhancing the buffering capacity of their trusted caregivers to help them regulate their stress response. The executive order to end the damaging practice of unnecessarily removing vulnerable children from the buffering protection of their trusted caregivers was an important first step. However, we have an obligation to address the harms that are currently facing the children who have already been subject to this policy. Without intervention, they are at high risk for both short and long-term health consequences. Thank you for this opportunity to share the science of toxic stress, and I ask that you use this science to inform your actions on behalf of the American people.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And I think laying out the toxic stress and the underlying chemistry behind it and how that's related to what these children are facing is very helpful. Thank you. Reverend Dr. Carmelo Santos.
Thank you. I must confess that as a father, listening to these stories is really, really hard. But it is also very inspiring to see so many people that want to make a difference. And that's why we're here. Good afternoon. Thank you for holding this hearing on the issue of the separation of children from their parents and the indefinite detention of families seeking asylum on our borders. I come before you today as a pastor and as a theologian, but also as a father and as a citizen, to express my concern about the well-being of these children and to voice my opposition against what seems to me to be a cruel and inhumane way of treating asylum seekers. I believe these policies are not just illegal, but also morally abhorrent and a clear departure from the values that are supposed to be the bedrock on which this country is built. I would like to use this opportunity to share with you a brief ethical and theological analysis of why these policies are immoral and must stop. As a teacher and preacher, I think in metaphors and parables. Allow me to share with you one such parable that I have found helpful in understanding and explaining the current situation, what ethicists call a thought experiment. Suppose that my neighbor's house is on fire, and the only way out is through my yard. Now imagine that my neighbor not only jumps the fence onto my property with her children, but also comes and knocks on my door to ask for help. What if my response, rather than helping them, is to call the police on them because they have clearly broken the law and invaded my property? If they needed help, they should have called 911, I say, not invade my property. Our neighbor's house is on fire, and they are knocking at our doors asking for help. The flames consuming their homes might not be those of literal fire, but they are as destructive. They are the flames of gang violence, of extreme poverty, and the terrible threats and reality of sexual violence, even against their youngest daughters and sons. They are knocking at our doors after having been through hell in order to get here. And now, instead of listening to their plight and helping them, we're detaining them like criminals and snatching their children from them, piling up violence upon violence. And we're supposed to be the good guys. After all, we have right next to our fence a big statue with an invitation that reads, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, journeying to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." do we need to remove that sign? We are dangerously drifting away from those beautiful values of compassion, mercy, fair play, hard work, and justice upon which this nation is founded. In this process of shifting from a country that prides itself on its values of welcoming refugees and immigrants to a country that views them with suspicion and treats them as criminals, even children, the Bible has been invoked. Therefore, since the Bible is such a powerful book, it is important to reflect carefully on its proper and improper use. In my evangelical Lutheran tradition, the Bible is considered the norm and rule of faith and practice. But it is also understood that it stands in need of careful study and prayerful interpretation. Otherwise, it becomes a dangerous book that can and has been used to justify horrible acts of violence and the systemic oppression of entire groups of people. The Bible has texts that can certainly be used for those purposes, but you should know that within the Bible itself, there is also a corrective tradition against such misuses and abuses. Theologians refer to that corrective as the prophetic. Prophets are not seers of the future, like Nostradamus. Prophets were messengers sent by God to the people when they were drifting away from the ways of mercy and justice. Their message disclosed God's passionate concern for the most vulnerable members of society. In biblical times, they were usually the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners. The words of the prophets are often harsh and provocative. Here is an example from the prophet Isaiah, speaking about a situation not too different than our own, but thousands of years ago. This is what he said: "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless. What will you do on the day of reckoning, when disaster comes from afar? To whom will you run for help? Where will you leave your riches? Nothing will remain but to cringe among the captives or fall among the slain." Those are harsh words from the prophet, but they display the ethical prophetic core of the Bible. The ultimate purpose of the prophet, of course, is to move the people to repentance so that they will return to the way of mercy and justice and become once again a blessing to the nations. The same emphasis on mercy is found in the way that Jesus interpreted the Bible in making moral decisions. When a woman is brought before him who had been caught in adultery, he knew that the law was very clear on the matter, and yet he chose mercy rather than the indiscriminate application of the law, which would have cost her her life. She was guilty, but Christ chose mercy. That is, in fact, the very heart of Christianity. That instead of applying the full weight of the law that our sins deserve, Christ chose mercy instead and offered himself as a sacrifice for all humanity, even his enemies. Going back to my thought experiment about my neighbor's house on fire, what then would be the moral thing to do in that case? Isn't the ultimate purpose of the law to ensure the well-being of the people, what ethicists call the common good? Moreover, what if it turns out that the reason that my neighbor's house is on fire was because of a cigarette that I had been smoking the night before and threw out the window and into their yard, not realizing that their grass was dry and combustible? Am I wrong to assume that a contributing factor, among many others, to the fire burning in these countries has been U.S. interventions, both direct and indirect? Whether justified or not is a matter for another time. I find it ironic that it is thanks to those foreign interventions that today I, a Puerto Rican-born U.S. American citizen, get to be here before you and then go home to my children and my family, while my sisters and brothers born by chance elsewhere, no less smart, kind, or capable than me, are in cages right now and heartbroken, wondering where their children are. What is happening to these children and to these families is unjust, morally unjustifiable, and must stop. Finally, I want to leave you with an often quoted but seldom practiced biblical saying: "I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Truly I tell you, Just as you did not do it to one of the least of this, you did not do it to me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Reverend Santos. And we're now going to turn to my colleagues who are going to take 5 minutes apiece to ask some questions or make some key points. And we're turning first to Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire.
Well, thank you, Senator Merkley, for gathering us today. Thank you to all of the witnesses who not only came here today to share your expertise and your observations and your hopes, as well as your significant and completely rational concerns with all of us. It has been extraordinary testimony, and I hope we can make sure that all of our constituents have the opportunity to hear it and understand it as we have been able to do firsthand. I had planned to ask specifically about the impact of this kind of separation on children, on their health and well-being. Doctor, you did a superb job of explaining that for us, so I appreciate it very much. I am thinking a lot about the people of my state of New Hampshire. Before I was senator, I was governor, and every year I would preside over a special ceremony that we had to honor foster parents and adoptive parents, to honor people often who had taken on the challenge and the great privilege of welcoming a child who had had great difficulty early in their life into their homes and making them part of their family. So I have seen firsthand the extraordinary kindness and generosity of the people of my state and the people of our country, and I know all of you have too. And I think as we grapple with this terrible tragedy on our border, these human rights abuses, as at least one of you has rightly called it, of ripping children from their families, I think what would be very useful to my constituents is to understand how to address the issue of families coming in such desperation to our borders in light of my constituents' concerns, too, about making sure we are safe as a country and that we follow the rule of law as a country. And I think many of our constituents have been presented with this false choice, that we either have to do this barbarism at our border, or we won't be safe. And we know that is not, in fact, the case. So I wanted to start with Ms. Altman. You referenced some of the pilot programs we have that both treat people fleeing great hardship and persecution at our borders with dignity, but also making sure that they show up in court and are subject to the rule of law as we would all want them to be. So can you expound a little bit on the programs that have been successful in keeping families together while ensuring that the rule of law is followed?
Absolutely, and thank you for asking what I think is actually a question that sort of gets to the heart of the matter. So thank you, Senator Hassan. Yes, and I think that the answer to this question is important for the issue of family separation, but also generally across the immigration detention system where adults are held who were not separated from their families unjustly in a large majority of cases. So as I mentioned, ICE does receive an appropriated budget every year for an alternative detention program. They're currently funded to have as many as 79,000 participants in these programs, which is a significant number and certainly far, far more than would be necessary to accommodate the families that are currently separated from each other. The alternative to detention programs operate on a spectrum. Some of them allow for or require pretty significant supervision of the individual or the family in the program. They can require check-ins with immigration and custom enforcement as regularly as the officer supervising the program requires. They can sometimes require check-ins at a person's home. They are all based on or should be based on an individualized assessment of the risk that that person might or might not pose to the community and what might be needed in order to ensure that that person shows up for their court hearing. I'll share a couple of statistics and then I'll say a little bit more about that risk assessment. As I mentioned, so there's the cost saving. Alternatives to detention can range from anywhere as little as $4 for an individual up to $30. That would be compared to the daily cost of a family detention bed, which is about $319. That's according to DHS, or the cost for an individual adult detention bed, which is about $134, according to ICE. So it's mind-boggling almost, the cost saving to use alternatives to detention. Then there's the amazing compliance rates that these programs can boast. The family case management program, which I mentioned, had literally 99% and 100% compliance rates, but across the programs you see compliance rates of upwards of 90%. And then, of course, the most important point, which is that these programs allow individuals to remain in the community, to feel welcomed into our, as you said, very, very generous and welcoming communities across the United States. What I am going to say is that we have to remember that what we're looking at right now is a historical anomaly. More than 40,000 individuals in immigration detention on any given day. If you go back to just as recently as 1994, that number was around 6,000. Yeah. When you look at ICE's own data, it is clear, and they will say, using their own risk assessments, that more than 50% of those detained pose zero risk to the community. The people we're talking about today could not be more highly incentivized to show up for their immigration court hearings. They've come here to find protection for themselves and their family. They want to go to court. They want to seek the protection. They want to do what they're supposed to do to follow the legal process here. And so these are programs that, you know, I sit back sometimes and I think should have bipartisan acclaim in every way, shape, or form, and I'm so happy to see that I think that's starting to happen. This is the better way. It is the compassionate way.
Well, thank you, and Senator, thank you for letting us run long.
It's amazing how quickly 5 minutes can pass as we experience in these hearings, and we're going to turn now to Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. And Senator Merkley, let me just say thank you for bringing us here together. Thank you to all of you for what you are doing and continue to do. Monday, I was down in McAllen, Texas, in Brownsville. I saw the Port Isabel Detention Facility. I saw the CBP Processing Center. It is heartbreaking. So I have some follow-up questions because I just cannot seem to get all of the data that I need from, unfortunately, from those who are in leadership in these agencies. And for me, and I think many of us, it starts with this data. So let me ask you this. We are now fighting for, and we just got the court decision for reunification. And my understanding after going to the first processing center, that is everybody who comes through, including children, have an identifying number, and they should be able to be tracked and know where they're being sent. But what I'm hearing from the secretary and at the higher up levels is that there can be no reunification. So what are you seeing? And I'm going to, I guess, address this right now to Heidi and Mimi. What are you hearing? There has to be a way that they've tracked these children and their parents to know where they are and to be easily reunified if that's what they choose to do. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Mimi, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. It's hard for me I can't see the other people testifying, so appreciate that. Thank you for that question. It's a really, really important one. You are correct that everybody who goes into detention, either an adult or a child, is given what's called an A number, a unique identifying number. And you are also correct, and we believe that that some agency in the federal government knows where every parent and child is, at least those who remain still in custody. However, what has been very alarming to us on the ground, and what was actually echoed in the court's decision last night, is that when the separation occurred, there did not seem to be a uniform method to track the parents and the child. We've heard some things about, some information being put into files, but there does not appear to have been a uniform method. There certainly was nothing put in place to ensure, as we've heard from other people testifying, any sort of regular communication between the parent and the child and reunification. And again, this matches what we've seen. It actually also matches, I think, what many members of these various agencies have said, and then it also matches what the federal court said last night in the injunction that was issued. And I will note, if you haven't had a chance to read the decision, the judge is extraordinarily upset and notes that it appears that our criminal justice system tracks one's property, automobiles, cash, much more closely than the than DHS and HHS have tracked people's children, which is a terrifying, terrifying thought. I will also note that, as I mentioned earlier, we are working with 381 parents, and thus far we know of only 4 who have been reunited with their children, and that those 4 have been reunited in the last 5 days, but those were families who had been separated very shortly before the executive order. Folks who we spoke to in, any time before that, to the best of our knowledge, all of those families remain separated right now, and no one has come up with any information for us or for the parents as to when reunification is going to occur and under what circumstances, which is extraordinarily troubling.
Thank you. Heidi, do you have anything else to add?
I would echo it. We see a little bit further down the line, right? So Mimi's right there at the moment of separation. We're seeing the kids once they've already been in ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement custody for a bit. I think Secretary Azar is presenting a very orderly process that doesn't exist. I understand that CBP has represented there is a tracking number that is applied to the entirety of the family. Our legal services teams who are providing legal services to the kids in ORR custody have never experienced or seen that tracker number.
So you've never seen a tracker number. So what I'm hearing is that the agencies, the federal agencies, whether it's CBP, ICE, and or HHS, they're not communicating with one another, not sharing data or information on the children.
That's right. And so you'll frequently have, when a child comes into custody, I'll give you a very illustrative example of a child who came into custody on June 11th, and we are representing the child. He's 4 years old. Only yesterday was ORR able to determine where the father was, and he had been deported. And so our legal services team represents that as the average. It's about a couple weeks of the child being in ORR custody until ORR is able to determine where the parent is, and that's on ORR reaching out desperately to unresponsive ICE deportation officers.
And then add to that children of tender age, right, that are young, under than 5, can't talk, can't explain what's going on, really don't even know a phone number to call. You add that to this, and it makes it much more difficult to reunify.
And they're trying to articulate their asylum claim,
exactly.
I would add.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just want to add that the case managers who are providing, ongoing day-to-day operations and caring for the safety and protection of children are doing this investigating work of trying to locate parents when the top priority is caring for the children that are in their care. So I think that that's also the challenge. But no, the family unit number that is, supposed to follow with the child and to connect the child with the family is not known at the time. So the 5 to 10 to a couple of weeks of locating a parent is reality.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you again for everything you're doing.
Thank you very much, Senator Cortez Masto. And now we'll turn to Senator Cardin.
Well, Senator Merkley, thank you for bringing us together, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership and personal time spent to inform the members of the Senate and the American people what's happening on the border, and thank you all for being here today. I just want to first start with the urgency in so many different directions. We can be encouraged with the court decision we got this week about the reunification, but let us remember that we got a favorable court decision in regards to Muslim ban immigration, only to be reversed by a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court. And yet we look to our judges as a check and balance on the abuse of powers of the executive branch We don't know whether we have that in the Supreme Court of the United States. And I say that on a day where Justice Kennedy just announced he is resigning from the Senate, from the Supreme Court. So we have another challenge in regards to whether we're going to have a court that's going to be a check and balance on our system, or one that's going to be supportive of President Trump's abuse of powers in the White House. I want to, again, also point out what we all have been saying, but I'll put a face on it. I have followed the immigration issues here. I've been to Central America. I've been to the neighborhoods. I've talked to parents. I've talked to the FBI. And we have parents that are faced with a very tough decision as to whether their teenage child is going to be subjected to joining a gang, which means, in most cases, murdering someone as ignition to get into the gang, or be subjected to potential being murdered himself or the family being murdered. So what do you do as a parent? Your first obligation is to protect your child. So you remove your child from that circumstance and you look for a safe haven. And the United States has always been the beacon of the world as a safe haven country. So you show up at our border, not sneaking in. You walk across the bridge into the United States and tell the immigration officers you're here, you're seeking asylum here in America, and the next thing you know, you're arrested as a criminal. You're no risk to the people of America, and your child's taken away from you. I mean, that's the face of what we're dealing with in these circumstances. And then the president says, well, I'll reunite the children, but I have a 20-day limitation, 20-day limitation being put on by the courts because of unaccompanied children, not with parents, making sure that they get adequate placement within 20 days, and then saying we have to change that law when the president needs to change the policies, not the laws that we have in regards to children. I just want to set that stage because we got to make it clear to the American people the urgency of what we are dealing with under President Trump's policies. So this is the amazing thing that I've had. We had Senator Wyden, who was a ranking member on a hearing we just had with Secretary Azar, and I still can't get an answer to the question. Where are the children and where are their parents? So Ms. Underwood, you're my favorite here because you're from Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, which is located in Baltimore, so you get special privileges here. I love you all, believe me. I love the work you all are doing. But what's so difficult? I understand we protect the privacy of people. That's all for that. But why can't we get where the children are and where the parents are so we at least know the numbers? What's so complicated about this?
It's not complicated. Thank you. Thank you for laying that out for us. I don't think we have much to add. I will go back to what I said during my testimony, which is that one thing Secretary Azar did say yesterday, which I thought was interesting, is for him, it's very easy to sit down and with, I think he said, a couple keystrokes using the portal, right, figure out where the parent of every child is. The answer is why it's so complicated. ICE won't release the parents. We've already talked about the very many ways they can do that. But as soon as a parent is released to a family member, to a shelter, to many of actually the homes of very generous Americans who've stepped forward to open up their homes, then at that moment, the Office of Refugee Resettlement can quickly reunify, has full discretion to quickly reunify the children to the parent. But the problem is if the child has no other sponsor to reunify, ORR is not reunifying because the parent is in ICE custody. There is nothing complicated about it. It is merely DHS's refusal to release the mothers and the fathers.
And just to be clear, that the reunification of the children needs to happen in the community.
Right. So I guess one last point, if I might. So the judge's injunction order, will that expedite ICE's handling of the parent or not?
So I can take that one. The injunction is broad and I think appropriately aggressive given the circumstances. So what the judge has said is a couple of things. One, the judges said that all deportations have to stop. And that's critically important because of what I was saying before and the comments we just heard, that at least one thing ICE has been doing, rather than releasing parents so they can be reunited, is deporting them, which makes it infinitely more difficult to reunite them. So the judge says that has to stop. The judge also ordered that families have to be reunited promptly and gave a timeline for families with kids under 5 and under, I believe, it is 14 days. For all other families, it's 30 days. The judge also said that within 10 days, everybody needs to be in contact with one another, meaning that parents have some sort of mechanism to be in contact with their child and make sure that he or she is okay. And so that obviously, that injunction, I think, goes to your frustration. The judge, you can tell it in the decision, feels very similarly. And, the response should be exactly what we are all asking for. A couple of things I'd like to caution this committee to consider. Number one, I have not heard yet what the Trump administration and the Department of Justice plans to do in response, but of course they have the option to appeal. I would very much hope that in this moment, and given the heartbreak that so many have suffered collectively watching this happen, that they will not appeal. But I think that obviously that message should be loud and clear, that they should comply and not appeal. If they do appeal, I think then members of Congress have a particularly special obligation to be pushing these exact same reforms forward, even while the appeal is going.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cardin. Senator Cardin has been an outspoken opponent of the family separation policy and has called on the president to end this policy that he created with the stroke of a pen. And thank you. And we're now turning to Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, who pressed the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, in a committee hearing over the need to protect and reunify families. Thank you for being outspoken, Senator Wyden.
Well, Senator Merkley, thank you. And I'm sure our guests and certainly senators know that the person who went to the border and really woke up the whole country to the lack of transparency and accountability was my colleague from Oregon, Senator Merkley. So I just want to let him know again how I appreciate his leadership. Now, I'm the senior Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, which Senator Cardin, Senator McCaskill, and I all are part of, and we place a special emphasis on child welfare in the Senate Finance Committee because we have jurisdiction over a number of programs that relate to the safety of kids. So I'm going to ask you this question, Ms. Underwood, and I appreciate all of you, so anybody who'd like to chime in. The two questions that I asked Secretary Azar were, I thought, pretty straightforward. The first was, how many children has the Department of Health and Human Services reunited with parents or relatives? That was question one. Question two was, how many parents have been told where their children are? And that is a special concern of Oregonians because Senator Merkley and I and our House colleagues went to the prison in Sheridan, and we heard from one father who said specifically he did not know where his daughter was. His 18-month-old daughter, by the way. So, as my colleagues know, Senator McCaskill, the Secretary did practically everything but answer the question. He bobbed and weaved, and he had all kinds of sort of deflecting kinds of answers. You know, there were hotlines. I thought he was going to then say cold lines. He just kept talking about portals, and I kept trying to picture the individuals Senator Merkley and I had seen, the detainees at Sheridan, and I just felt that the Secretary's responses were disconnected from reality. And parents are clearly having problems getting access to the hotline. At one point, Ms. Underwood, we were told that the detainees were given phone numbers for their lawyers, but they were in the clothes that they had brought to the prison, and then the phone numbers weren't given to them when they gave those clothes up for the detainee uniforms. And Mr. Azar also gave me different answers as to how many children are in the agency's custody. According to the number he gave me in yesterday's hearing, it was 2,047. So as of last night, at the rate the agency's going based on our estimates, these kids wouldn't be reunited with their families until 2025. So that is obviously a shocking assessment based on what happened yesterday morning. Now, we got news that I think all of us would consider potentially positive last night, where the judge ordered the administration to reunite the families within 30 days. So I think, Ms. Underwood, because we've got colleagues here from all of the relevant, committees, I think we would be interested in your view, given the fact just between the finance hearing in the morning and what happened late at night, and we've had other things that we're trying to stay on top of in terms of holding down healthcare costs. Give us your assessment of what you think our committee, with jurisdiction over a number of these child welfare programs, ought to be doing now, because we have champions of kids like Senator McCaskill, very much concerned about the next steps, and I think we'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yes, thank you. So I think for the next steps with the children, and I think Heidi also shared, is definitely releasing the parents from ICE detention in order to facilitate reunification. And I cannot stress enough that reunification needs to happen within the community, safely and appropriately. And I think that that's the larger concern here, and the one question that many of us are asking of how will the children be reunified. And so the Office of Refugee Resettlement has a process, a family reunification process, when a sponsor is identified. But again, as Heidi also stated, and others, the identification of the sponsor who they were traveling with is currently detained. So the next steps here are in order to reunify individuals in the community, reunify kids with their parents in the community, would be expeditiously releasing their parents from detention to facilitate the reunification.
You are being way too logical for what Senator McCaskill and I heard yesterday in the Finance Committee, and I had a sense you might have some practical recommendations like that. How do we somehow square your practical recommendations with that 30-day timetable? Because, and perhaps your colleague would like to get into this, there's a far cry from the 30 days and what we thought when we left yesterday's hearing room, that changing the number by 6, which is what we thought in a week, took us to 2025. So tell us how we use those good recommendations in the kind of 30-day context.
Well, as a physician, I just wanted to add, in terms of the 30-day context, what the science shows us is that every day that a child is separated from their caregiver puts their health at risk. And I believe that the judge's injunction that asks for reunification rightly recognizes the science that the cumulative adversity, and every day that these kids are away from their parents, we as Americans are putting those children at risk, and we have to live with that.
Senator,
I think my time is really about up, but I want to give other panel members a chance to comment. That point with respect to the toll it takes on kids, the more we learn about neurological research, and you're a physician, is if you don't get there early for kids, like that 18-month-old little girl who was taken from her father, and the day before Father's Day, he was telling Senator Merkley and myself in the Oregon Congressional Delegation, there's no question that is going to do a lot of damage, and it will be playing catch-up ball from that point on, trying to repair the damage, done. All the more urgency to make the 30 days work. I'm way over my time that my colleague has indulged me in. Do any of you, let's do this. If you have any recommendations for us on the Finance Committee, Senator McCaskill, Senator Cardin, myself, I'm sure there have been others who've come, we would very much welcome them, because I've been trying overnight to reconcile that number that we were given yesterday morning. We wrapped up at noon, and then the staff went and calculated that rate. Kids would be reunified with families in somewhere like 2025. That changed in the evening, but I don't know how they actually carry out that 30 days, especially if they continue to use these fantasy land assessments of what they're doing. So, Senator Merkley, again, thank you for being our leader on this.
Senator Wyden, thank you very much, and I'm so glad that you were able to visit the 123 adults, including a significant number of parents who were incarcerated in Oregon under this policy. We'll now turn to Senator Clara McCaskill of Missouri, who has called the president's policy misguided and called for an end to the family separations. Delighted to have you.
Thank you. As the ranking member on Homeland Security, I'd like to talk about how this problem has highlighted an additional problem and call on your expertise, particularly Ms. Underwood, as it relates to the children that were already in custody due to unaccompanied status that have come to this country. For 4 years, I've been working to try to get a joint protocol between DHS and HHS as it relates to these children. Before we had another hearing back earlier this spring, they finally came up with an MOU, and there's some concerns about that MOU, which I understand, but what is, I think people need to understand that are not on the committee and that aren't aware of this, is unlike in other areas of child welfare. When you have a child in my state that doesn't have a guardian, then the state takes responsibility for their welfare. And they have an obligation to track them, to make sure they are in a safe environment. There are many times the addition of a guardian ad litem or a court-appointed special advocate. There are child welfare or agencies. In this instance, HHS continues to say, once we place them with a sponsor, we're done. And I don't think everybody in Congress realizes that there is not an obligation on the part of HHS to hook that child up with the state residency of child welfare. So let's say they put him with a sponsor in Kansas City, one of these children that has come unaccompanied. There is never any heads up to the state of Missouri that there is a child that has been placed in a home where nobody is following up to see if that child is okay. And could you speak to that as an ongoing issue that is not directly related to the separation at the border, but it certainly shows that we have not been paying attention to the children?
Yes, thank you. And I think what you kind of highlight here is the need for comprehensive case management.
Exactly.
For children that are released from the care and custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. As you've, again, highlighted, that all children do not receive post-release services in this comprehensive case management. And I believe that, you mentioned alerting child welfare, but I think in order to kind of manage what you are talking about and to kind of mitigate many of the risks that occur at family reunification is to be able to provide comprehensive case management for children being released to their sponsors.
Because we did the hearing 4 years ago with the trailer in Ohio full of children that were being worked on an egg farm. And they had been released to these sponsors. And, of course, that's one of the problems we have now about releasing the kids who are trying to reunite with their parents is they finally requiring fingerprints. But now they've gone so far, they not only want fingerprints of the parents, they want fingerprints of the entire household. And that is obviously slowing down the process of reunification in this exacerbated problem we have because they separated people, children at the border in order to criminally prosecute. So I just want to highlight that because I think while we're working on this problem as to how we reflect the values of this country in terms of how we treat children, I think we've got to also make sure that we're fixing the law to make sure that HHS does not lose responsibility for these children and they have an obligation to give them comprehensive case management even after they're placed with sponsors.
Yes, I mean, it's difficult for families during, I mean, family reunification isn't one point in time. And it happens, while the child arrives to the home and, there's additional support. Individuals are stressed, worried about their legal cases, and comprehensive case management can help, sponsors engage other systems, educational systems, access mental health and medical services, and just...
And that's one of the reasons they say they're missing. Yeah. They're just not showing up at court because they got no case management. Nobody's paying attention if they show up in court.
And I believe, and we have definitely documented success with post-release services that, a high rate, above 90% of our children who are released to the community that have comprehensive case management definitely do show up in court, as Heidi mentioned about the family case management program as well.
Right.
And
pretty important.
Senator McCaskill, we're grateful for the focus that you have placed on the child welfare needs. I just, if I may, wanted to flag one more quick point, which is that as the fingerprinting requirement has expanded, we also really encourage stronger oversight over the memorandum of agreement that is now operational between ICE and ORR.
Because of sharing of status.
Yeah, because what we're seeing, and this is relevant for the children who've been separated as well, because many of them are being reunified to other family members, is that if the closest family member, the person who is going to be most able to provide that true care and comfort to the child, is afraid that coming forward is going to result in their detention and deportation, then that's a very difficult choice and one that's really unfair. What it is going to end up meaning is that children are being released to someone they're not as comfortable with, someone that they're not as familiar with, and that really goes against basic child welfare norms and what's in the best interest of the child.
Senator, something that I heard from the people that I interact with, especially this morning, I heard two stories of parents that are receiving advice that is troubling because they're being told that the longer they remain in custody in the U.S., the more likely it is that they will lose their children to the foster care system, and then they won't be able to reunite. And so they're being encouraged to sign, I think it's voluntary deportation, only to find out that they were not going to be reunited with the children over there. So now you have the parents there and then the children here. And I have not heard that mentioned, so I thought it's important that you know that they're feeling that pressure.
Thank you very much, Senator McCaskill. And we'll now turn to Senator Coons, who has focused intensely on foreign policy, which certainly comes to bear in this issue. And welcome, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, I've worked hard on trying to make progress on immigration reform and to make responsible investments in securing our border and make responsible progress towards immigration reform, but to do so in a way that fits with our values. That meets our international obligations and that meets the core values on which this country was founded. And so I have a series of questions, but if I could just, on that line of conversation, Dr. Burke-Harris, your work highlights how adverse effects are significant for children throughout their lifetimes. Children who are subject to trauma, and in particular the trauma of separation, then suffer from that for long periods of time. Can you explain why it's critical we reunite children with their parents right away, and then talk, if you might, about how the Trump administration's desire to replace family separation, this immoral, forcible separation of parents and children, with indefinite detention may simply be trading one trauma for another. Do you think indefinite detention would lead to child trauma and to challenges for families that in many cases are coming here seeking asylum?
So in terms of the long-term health implications on children, as I mentioned in my testimony, number one, what we recognize is that many of these children and families are coming to the United States because they are escaping situations that have been extremely stressful and traumatizing. And and made a harrowing journey to the United States. And in that case, these children are extremely vulnerable to developing a toxic stress response. And having a loving, trusted caregiver during that process, oftentimes for many of these children, is the most important thing that's keeping them from developing short and long-term severe health implications, from asthma to allergies to autoimmune disease and down the long road, heart disease and cancer. The policy of separating children from their caregivers in this situation very much seems like the way to the most harmful and most damaging way that we could possibly try to enforce our borders, short of physically, and in this case, the damage is physical. And I think that we recognize more and more that the science shows us that this is what the harm that happens. In terms of changing from separating parents and caregivers from their children to detaining them together, obviously that also, being incarcerated is a stressful or traumatic experience. The question in this situation is really, is there a way to enforce our laws that minimizes the dose of adversity that these children are experiencing? And I think that past administrations have been able to do that, and this is really a policy choice around how we're enforcing this. And the big concern here is that we're making this policy choice now with full knowledge about the biological harms that are being visited on children.
Thank you, Doctor. It bears repeating that this was not compelled by law, not a decision made by Democrats, but a choice of this administration to impose a zero-tolerance policy with the intentional consequence of the separation of parents and children, to use children really as hostages or as bargaining chips in an effort to secure a particularly extreme view of our immigration law. Ms. Altman, if I might, President Trump said tweeted this weekend, that undocumented immigrants, quote, must immediately, with no judges or court cases, unquote, be sent home. As a lawyer who's committed to the rule of law and is concerned about the consequences of our president's actions as well as his statements, can you tell us what due process protections migrants seeking asylum have in the United States and what that's rooted in, briefly, if you might?
I'm so grateful to you for raising that, Senator Coons. Thank you. So I think what the president's tweets made clear, if it wasn't already clear, is that both the family separation policy and now the proposal of mass and prolonged family detention in its place are a very intentional effort to undermine access to asylum. Access to asylum in the United States is guaranteed in our domestic law and the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's also obviously a very important part of our international law obligations. We are party to the Refugee Convention. What this administration has come very flippantly to refer to as loopholes are actually very basic threshold protections for individuals, whether they be adults, whether they be children who arrive at the border and who are seeking asylum. If there's one message I can get across on this point, it's that it is so difficult to get asylum in the United States, that we represent in some ways the folks who are lucky, the children and the adults who are able to get an attorney, but there is no right to counsel. And so what you have under the existing laws, right, are children and adults by themselves without counsel trying to meet what is a difficult threshold credible fear determination, which then allows them to proceed to court. Shutting down access to those protections, it's simply unlawful. In addition to, obviously, the ethical outrage.
Well, if I might then move to the ethical question. Thank you for the legal underpinnings, Reverend Dr. Santos. Thank you for your testimony and for reminding us in some ways that our country has a long moral tradition that's rooted in Torah, that's rooted in Scripture, that's rooted in the gospel. And you, in your testimony, spoke to a particularly challenging passage from Isaiah that should be chilling to those of us responsible for policy or law. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, who deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless, from Isaiah 10. But as you also mentioned, it is a risky thing to take a specific passage out of the Bible. You're at risk of saying something that actually doesn't comport with the whole arc of the gospel focus on mercy. I gave a floor speech recently where I responded to my former colleague, former Senator Sessions' citation of Romans 13, just the first 5 verses, to say that we have an obligation to follow the law, to obey authority, and to do so vigorously. I suggested that perhaps reading just about 5 or 6 more verses on either side would give a dramatically different reading to that narrow piece. Do you have any thoughts on the broader topic of how a misreading of Romans 13 or a misreading of any particular passage can be misused to justify oppression? And should we be concerned as a nation about the prophetic injunction in Isaiah 10 that you cited, that we are in a time when the organs of federal action are being used in an oppressive way, and then what that teaches to our children, to our own society, to the world about our commitment to mercy?
Thank you for your question, Senator. Yes, I think that we should be very concerned. I think we should be concerned because what the prophet is talking about is not, I think it's about the fact that actions have consequences. And when those actions are from the leadership, unfortunately, they have consequences for the entire nation, not just for the leaders themselves. And the consequences of these actions are going to be the way that we're viewed around the world. I think that the reason that we as a nation are so respected around the world is because of the sacrifices that we have been willing to make, and our soldiers have been willing to make since World War II, to protect the rights and the dignity of human beings around the world. And that is why we also had the moral bearing to be able to intervene in other places. But if you take that away, then you are giving resources to those that want to harm us. You are just playing into their game. Now, in terms of Romans 13, yes, every text has a context, and there are also assumptions. And that text of Romans 13 definitely assumes that rulers are there for the well-being of the people, and that you should obey them because they are looking for the common good. However, in another book, the book of Acts, it speaks about what to do when those rulers ask you to do something that is immoral, when those rulers tell you to do something that goes against what is just and what is fair, and you should obey God before men. And so, yes, it is a tricky thing to pick passages, but I just chose that one because it highlights the concern for the poor, for the widow, for the foreigner, for the orphans that you can see across the entire scriptures. Thank you again for your question.
Thank you. If I might, in closing, I'll just comment that we are not a perfect nation. We have made mistakes, at times grave mistakes in our past. The Refugee Convention was adopted in no small part because the United States, in the face of the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe, failed in its most basic moral obligation and rejected an entire shipload of Jewish migrants seeking refuge in the United States, most of whom were forcibly returned to Nazi Germany and subsequently died. And it was in the face of that moral failing by the United States that we ratified the convention that is the underpinning of our legal obligation, regardless of what the president says, an international treaty obligation now incorporated into American law that when someone presents themselves and is in America, they have process rights to be heard for that case before a determination is made whether they should be here or will be sent back. And frankly, the Supreme Court just this week revisited Korematsu, one of the worst decisions ever made by our Supreme Court, in which they used a very thin national security justification as a veneer to tolerate the forced incarceration of an entire group of American citizens just because of suspicions about their allegiance. We need to be better than this. And I'm grateful for your testimony today, for the voices and actions of colleagues like Senators Durbin, Senators Merkley, and others. I think we can and should be better than this. We've made mistakes in the past. We cannot tolerate this mistake on behalf of the American people now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Coons. And before I turn to Senator Durbin, I just want to follow up on this point. And Ms. Marziani, if I can ask you, have you seen any evidence that our border guards are proceeding to make it very difficult for those fleeing oppression to cross the pedestrian bridges to our ports of entry? Because what I saw when I was down there with a group of legislators a week ago Sunday was 4 American border guards in the middle of the bridge turning back those seeking asylum, letting through those with visas and those with passports. And a young woman that we met who had made it across had told us she had been rebuffed time and time again trying to cross the bridge to present her case for asylum, and that she'd only been able to get across that bridge after having been rebuffed many times. She realized that there were people out washing the windows of the cars. So instead of coming across the pedestrian bridge, she borrowed a squeegee and washed windows of cars entering the U.S. until she got clear to the American side, bypassing the American border guards, and thereby was able to present her request for asylum along with her 65-day-old child. Do you see evidence that the government of the United States is slow-walking admission of those of asylum seekers at our ports of entry?
Absolutely. This has been reported time and time again in Texas, including with photographic evidence of people sitting on bridges, people trying over and over. I'll also note, again, in the court opinion that was issued last night, the judge also includes this in her findings as well, that there has been what appears to be a deliberate attempt to block asylum seekers coming through the ports of entry, and it is extraordinarily concerning. I will also note, to bring us back to the beginning of my testimony, that we have heard specifically from the parents that we've interviewed stories of people, saying that they weren't doing a credible fear interview, but they were saying, I fear for my life, I'm fleeing violence, I'm seeking safety, and being treated with disregard by Border Patrol agents who said, oh, you're going to get deported, we're taking your kids from you, and treating that in a very flippant manner. So yes, we do have considerable evidence that has been happening.
So Ms. Altman, is it a violation of the Refugee Convention for the government of the United States to block those fleeing persecution from reaching a port of entry?
Yes, it's also a violation of our domestic statutory law.
Thank you. Senator Durbin, we're turning to you. You have been championing and pursuing fairness and justice for our dreamers. You have visited the Heartland Human Care Services Shelter for separated children in Chicago. You have spoken on the floor. Thank you for directing so much energy and attention to this issue.
Thanks, Senator Merkley, and particular thanks to our panel for being here today. I'd like to share a couple thoughts with you and then perhaps ask you to address a question. When we talk about vetted parents, we need to be careful. I've come to learn that there is an initial fingerprint taken by the Border Patrol as people come over the border. But once you're in the system, if you're going to be vetted, you now go through a second set of fingerprints by appointment. We don't know how long that takes. Some say it depends on where you are and where you are in the queue. So when we continue to hear things like children have access to vetted parents, just remember that in many cases, those parents will not be vetted until perhaps days or even longer after their separation. The second thing I learned when I went to the Heartland Alliance in Chicago was worrisome, and that is the fact that it is difficult for these agencies that are conscientious, and I believe Heartland is one of those agencies, to sometimes find the parent. They referred to it in the press as a scavenger hunt. Many times these adults and parents are being shifted from one place to another. I've seen that happen over and over again, and it's difficult to track them down where they are. And I asked a practical question. Assume you have an unaccompanied child or a child who's been removed from a parent who's at your shelter and gets sick. Let's take it, doctor, to a situation of convulsion, for example. Well, obviously, they're going to respond quickly, take the child to an emergency room and such, and the first thing the doctor's going to say, what's the history of this child? Has this child had a convulsion before? What can you tell me about the circumstance? Well, they have no medical record tracking that child, and they have limited, if any, access to the parent to ask fundamental questions on when it comes to medical history. So these kids are really adrift on a bureaucratic sea. And if something terrible happens to them, even the most conscientious caregiver, agency, contractor, is really at a disadvantage. The last point I want to make to you, and ask your comment on any of these that might be of interest to you, is I've sat down, Senator Merkley, across the table now from several Republicans to talk about this. They love to use a term which I find extremely rude and even offensive, catch and release, as if we're talking about bluegill or carp or catching a fish. It sickens me to think we're talking about human beings in that context, but they use it. And they're usually suggesting that once a person gets apprehended, stopped, interrogated, that when it's all over, they're turned loose and that they don't show up for hearings. So I know you've addressed earlier this whole question about alternatives to detention. And we know that alternatives to detention can be very effective, over 90%, in appearance after a person has been stopped, apprehended, and such. But I suppose what I'm learning is it's not just appearance at a hearing that some of the opponents are referring to. They are referring to something they call future flow. Now that is a deterrence that they're looking for. They believe that taking a child away from a mother would discourage other mothers from coming to the border, whatever their circumstances. And now that they've been stopped in that zero tolerance approach, they worry that whatever they give up now, even if it means 95% appearance at a hearing, that it won't be tough enough or mean enough or discouraging enough or a deterrent to others coming in across the border. That takes it to a different level, as far as I'm concerned. We're not talking about people appearing for their due process hearing. We're talking about a conduct by the United States, which they hope will discourage others from coming forward in the future. So I appreciate any comments you might have on those.
Thank you, Senator Durbin, for being such a champion on these issues, for visiting the facility and the children. I will add one point, which I think is connected to a question that Senator Coons asked earlier. The point that you make about access to medical records and the sort of brain knowledge of a parent about their child's medical history applies equally to the legal proceedings. And I just want to share very quickly the experience that we are facing, which is that as our attorneys are attempting to provide legal services to these children, while the ORR caseworkers are trying so hard to find the parents in this scavenger hunt, it strips the children effectively of their ability to present an asylum claim in their own independent proceedings. You can imagine a 4-year-old child trying to articulate to our attorneys why they're afraid to go back to their country. It would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic. Even in the case of 15, 16-year-olds, many times the parents have not told them everything about why they fled for very good protective instincts that we would all have as parents. And so I think this is yet another way in which this policy is stripping our country of providing access to asylum. And of course, I don't think any of us have actually said that the fact sheet that was released over the weekend that is supposed to be providing the roadmap for reunification only contemplates reunification in the context of removal, which really sets up an inherently coercive system in which parents have to choose between abandoning their asylum claims or being returned to their country of origin with their child.
If I may, Senator Durbin, as a physician, it's really important for me to present the science and to do so as much as possible in a nonpartisan manner. However, to deter individuals from coming to our country, we're not allowed to kill them. We're not allowed to burn them. We're not allowed to injure them. The policy of separating parents from their children injures children. It disrupts their brain development, it harms their immune system, it harms their hormonal systems, and it leads to long-term increased risk of a litany of health and mental health problems.
Senator, may I add something? I think that one of the issues has to do with language. You said that catch and release sounds so ugly, and words matter, and they have power in how we view reality and how we act in reality. That is why the ways that we use to refer to these immigrants is really important. And I was recently in a conversation where somebody said, these are not children, these are criminals. And then she proceeded to name gangs and things like that. But that was eye-opening for me because I understood then that they are not seeing children. They are seeing a threat. And that is something that we need to counter. And we do that by sharing the reality of who these people are that we're talking about. And that's what churches and mosques and synagogues are able to do because we work with the people directly. And I am the one that reads to them their letters and tell them when is it that they have to show up to court and go with them to court. And I see their resilience, I see their respect for the law, and that they really want to do things the right way. So we really need to be careful with the language that we use. You're right. And I like to say that immigration is not a problem to be solved. Immigration is a blessing to be claimed. We are blessed by immigrants in this country. I've seen it.
And then I just wanted to add really briefly that the zero tolerance policy and other harmful policies are not going to prevent individuals that are desperate and fleeing their countries because of persecution and just other threats that we've heard throughout the testimony. So I just, again, want to highlight that those harmful policies will not be deterring individuals that are desperate to be traveling and seeking refuge in the United States.
I'd like to echo that. I'd like to
Please
echo
go ahead.
that. I'm not going to echo it as an attorney. I'm going to echo it as a mom. I mean, the stories that we've heard, it is very hard for me to believe that family separation could be an effective deterrent given what people are fleeing from and given the calculus they've already made. So, and so again, that's me speaking not as an attorney, but as a mom who has seen this stuff up close.
Ms. Ullman, you made a point. I just want to make sure we understood it correctly. And thank you so much, Senator Durbin, that individuals are being told that if they pursue asylum, that they will continue to be held and separated from their children, but if they give up the asylum claim, will be reunited with their children. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so we are hearing that anecdotally. What I was referring to in terms of an actual policy statement is the June 23rd fact statement that was put out by DHS sort of outlining their plan for reunification, which very clearly provided a plan for reunification only in the case of removal. This is certainly trickling down to the parents in custody as they're making decisions. And I think it is very clear to them, as it's very clear to us, that the quickest way to be reunified with their child is to accept a deportation order, which for many of them will mean deportation back to harm. And so that is what I mean when I say inherently coercive.
Thank you.
May I add that we're hearing the exact same thing in Texas. And in fact, today we are mobilizing more attorneys to go down to the Port Isabel Center that I mentioned previously, which is outside of Brownsville, because we have been specifically hearing rampant reports that this very thing is happening there, that people are essentially being coerced into signing voluntary deportation orders.
A week ago Sunday, 7 members of Congress met with 10 women and who had been detained, and they gave us the stories one after another, saying that they were told that if they pursued asylum, they would be detained and kept separated from their children, but that if they dropped their asylum claim, they could be reunited more quickly. And it was just an impossible situation for them as they wrestled with what, knowing that to be returned to their home might well mean a death for them or their children. Thank you. We're going to turn to Senator Markey. And Senator Markey has written to the General Accountability Office requesting an opinion on whether zero tolerance policy constitutes a rule for the purposes of the Congressional Accountability Act. He is planning, if I have this right, to travel to the border this coming weekend for oversight on the administration's family reunification procedures. And we're delighted to have him focusing attention and putting a spotlight on this issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Merkley. Thank you for everything that you have done. We thank all of you for your leadership. We know that President Trump's zero tolerance policy is really a zero humanity policy. We know that it's authorized systematic child abuse along the southern border of the United States in the name of the American people who are outraged at what is being done in their name. So we thank you for being here, for bearing witness. And we know that you dedicate your lives to ensuring that people are treated with the utmost dignity, and we thank you for that. So given what has happened over the past 2 months, what is your level of confidence that the Trump administration is in fact going to abide by their now court-ordered mandate to unite these families?
Mimi, I think we're all looking to you.
I was afraid of that. Look, I actually don't know. I would very much hope that given the thrust of the executive order purporting to stop family separations in some way, and the absolute public outroar over this issue, that the Department of Justice would not seek appeal. And it is very clear to me, and I hope this is clear to the entire public, that if the Department of Justice seeks to appeal, that is just a kick in the face to not just all of these immigrant families, but all the people around America who have stood up and said, not in my country, this does not comport with my values. So that would be, so I would very much hope they don't appeal, but at this point, I haven't gotten any information one way or another.
Well, thank you all so much for your historically great work. We're in it with you all the way. You energize us to try to do even more. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Senator Markey. And we'll now turn to Senator Richard Blumenthal. He has visited detention facilities in Texas where children are being held. He has spoken outside the Border Patrol station in El Paso, noting that the human cost is severe. And he has written to Defense Secretary James Mattis, calling the incarceration of immigrant children on military bases immoral and unlawful. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to Senator Merkley for taking the lead on this very important hearing, and thank you to each of you who are here or connected to us, and not only for your physical presence today, but for the great work that you are doing. I know it has been a fairly lengthy afternoon, and I have followed from afar a lot of what you said, and I just applaud all of the views that you've expressed. I have been to the border a number of times, most recently 5 days ago, and I welcome the decision of the court within the last 24 hours that puts a time limit, 30 days, on the reunification completion. It's not developing a plan, it's reunification. And frankly, there is no plan right now from this administration. I saw none, I've heard none, and there is none. I also did see what may be the profoundly disturbing vision of the future, the tent city in Il Tornillo, which could be transplanted to military bases or elsewhere around the country. It already exists in a number of places. And so one of my questions to you, maybe we can begin with this question, is this kind of mass incarceration, really, ironically, it's the kind of internment that was done in World War II when people of Japanese descent were sent to what are now called by some concentration camps, call them prisons, call them detention facilities. What they do is confine people, deprive them of their liberty and of access to the outside world, and deprive all of us in the world generally of access to them without affording many basic services like education, freedoms that we believe are fundamental to our American democracy. So my question is whether you believe that, as I do, these camps would be equally violative of constitutional rights and basic humanitarian principles.
Could not agree more strongly. Thank you so much, Senator Blumenthal, for your visits and for raising this point. This is, I think it's been said this morning, this would be trading one abuse for another, trading one act of violence by our government for another. If the Department of Homeland Security has proven one thing in its operation of any detention setting, it's that it is not capable of setting up a system that can safeguard the health and safety of those it detains. Report put out last week by Human Rights Watch and other organizations documenting the frequency of deaths in custody that are attributable to medical negligence. You look back at the history of family detention, you hear harrowing stories in the existing facilities of mothers unable to get the medicine they needed for their children. This is not an alternative that any of us should be turning toward, especially when so many very reasonable and compassionate alternatives exist. And I just wanted to flag that this morning, my organization, the National Immigrant Justice Center, and 11 other civil rights and government transparency organizations are calling on the Appropriations Committee to reject the transfer of funds that would be necessary to build these tent camps, the 47,000 for families and the 20,000 for children. That we understand DOD and DHS are in contemplation of building. This is, to our view, one of the most critical ways that the legislative branch can put a stop, can put some sort of brakes on the abuses being committed, whether it's in the context of family separation or a ramp up of family detention. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add that kind of the executive order means that children, may go to jail with their parents. And I believe it's just an immigration policy and child welfare policies that are really at cross purposes. And, decisions like this just do not uphold child welfare principles and practices where children are detained in basically prisons and going to jail with their parents.
We're replacing family separation with family imprisonment.
Yes.
And by the way, I should have added, the cost per person at El Tornillo is $2,000 per day. Let me repeat that, $2,000 per day per person right now. Now, even if economies of scale cut it in half, it's still $1,000 per day, and there's no guarantee that it will cut that cost in half. And I hesitate even to raise the financial costs because the humanitarian and the moral costs are so much more profound. Sorry.
But Senator, that is a very important question. I come from Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is supposed to be, let's call it a protectorate of the U.S. We just got hit by a really bad storm, and there was a problem with the response, in part because it was very expensive with the other storms that were hit. And so the question is, where's the money going to come from? Who's not going to be getting that money? Who's going to pay for it? I would also like to reference a classic experiment in social psychology, the Stanford Prison experiment, where some students were designated as guards and other students were designated as prisoners. But they were students. And after only a few days, the guards were abusing the prisoners, and they had to stop the experiment because they were really getting into the role. Now imagine that in the context of an isolated camp where you have lots of people that are supposed to be refugees, but instead are being viewed as criminals. This morning, I was just talking to somebody about this and her experience crossing the border. And she was just saying how in front of everybody, of other guards, of other people, she was grabbed by this officer, and forgive my language, but she said, the first language I learned in English was bitch, because he kept calling me bitch, bitch, bitch. And this was an officer in front of everybody. What's going to happen behind closed doors, where even you senators are not allowed in?
I'd also just like to add that in her compelling op-ed, former First Lady Mrs. Bush noted that individuals who were interned in the Japanese camps had double the rate for heart disease. And we now know that this type of internment does inflict injury and increase the risk of disease and early death.
It inflicts physical trauma and potential exposure to disease, but the emotional trauma is incalculable. And I agree with you that that op-ed was very moving, but I just want to conclude on this note that we need to make the American people aware. And by the way, I just add one footnote. You said that Puerto Rico has just been hit by a storm. Actually, it was 3/4 of a year ago. And the reason I add this footnote is that the delay in responding to that humanitarian crisis is unforgivable. And we need to keep in mind that those citizens are Americans. They are Americans, just as we would never tolerate in Connecticut or in Washington, D.C., the delay in responding to the humanitarian crisis in healthcare and utilities and education that was created by Maria, and more fundamentally by the unfair healthcare and tax policies that have been foisted on Puerto Rico. So you're right, resources matter. You're absolutely right about that point. And to spend $2,000 per day per individual on a camp that isolates these boys from the outside world and subjects them to indefinite and indiscriminate imprisonment, and now to think about doing the same for whole families, I think is a train wreck for this nation financially, morally, legally. So thank you. I realize I've gone over my time, and I apologize.
Thank you much, Senator Blumenthal. I'm so glad you went down to visit personally and to try to investigate, because really we're trying to get beyond the wrap of secrecy that the administration has placed over these activities. In fact, today's hearing is trying to get your expertise, our witnesses' expertise, in order to understand the situation better and to continue our work of oversight and development of pressure on the administration to reverse what they have done, on the president personally to reverse what he has done with the stroke of his pen, and certainly to help guide us as we try to find other ways to apply pressure through the legislative process. I want to note that we have had, according to CNN's report of Health and Human Services numbers, just 6 children returned, just 6. Now, 6 in 6 days from Health and Human Services across the nation. They told us on June 20th they had 2,053 children in their care, and that as of yesterday they had 2,047. I apologize to a news agency that I told in Oregon this morning that only 5 children have been returned. So I correct that now. It's 6 children. Reverend, thank you for putting us through the thought exercise of a neighbor's house on fire, perhaps a fire that had accidentally been caused by ourselves, and certainly reflects the fact that here in America, the money we pay for illegal drugs drives much of the drug cartel activity in Central America that is causing many people to lose control of their institutions, the control of their neighborhoods, and to flee the violence associated with those cartels. Dr. Harris, you gave us the chemistry of how separation inflicts harm with a series of functions within the body, and how a hug starts to end that, and how important the parent connection is in that regard. And Ms. Underwood, to have given us the perspective from an organization that the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services that works so hard to assist with refugees and with the care of children from that perspective. Ms. Altman, I appreciate very much your legal perspectives and your clarification that for the administration to be slow-walking the ability of individuals to cross at ports of entry to present their asylum claims is a violation of the Refugee Convention, and I think you said, and perhaps American law. That is an issue we need to pursue further, because the administration keeps saying there's no reason to cross in between ports of entry because you can come to the ports of entry, encouraging folks to do so. And those who work with refugees have told me that if you're rebuffed at that moment and go back to the Mexican side of the border, you are easy prey for gangs with really bad consequences that can follow. And Mimi Marziani with the Texas Civil Rights Project, thank you for giving us the direct knowledge of the work that you all are doing down on the border. So we are at a moment that we are wrestling with a profound corruption of the vision that Lady Liberty has always stood for. Lady Liberty holding her torch to light the way for those fleeing oppression, giving a warm welcome to the world, and now instead her inscription saying, if you wash up on our shores, fleeing persecution, you will be met with handcuffs, prison, your children will be taken away, you'll be treated as a criminal. Quite a different story, inconsistent, it's particularly egregious for a nation where so many of us in America come from all corners of the world. Our families come from all corners of the world. In virtually every family history, there's some story of fleeing persecution, be it religious persecution, be it famine, be it civil conflict or war. And so thank you for bearing witness today with all these diverse perspectives, shedding light on this situation, and for the great work you do every day. The members of the Senate, the members who have come here today, are really grateful for the work you're doing and the insights you're providing. And with that, I'm going to adjourn this hearing of Children in Crisis, the human and lasting impact of the administration's child separation policy. And I will note I have to run to another appointment, so I'm going to follow up and thank you personally later. But right now I have to dash out the door. Thank you. Adjourned.
Thank you.